All right, everybody. Welcome today. We're going to be talking about some statements that were made by Afroman. And I just wanted to, like I mentioned in my workout stream, I was going to talk about this because it's such an important topic to discuss and dispel any kind of misconception, misunderstanding. Because, in my opinion, I don't think that the statements he made brings us together in any way, shape, or form. It only seeks to divide us and create a lack of unity and discordance amongst people of African descent. And we need to stop making statements that only leads to that kind of outcome. I'm going to leave the line open today. If you want to call in, the number is 832-569-3727. You can call in, make your contributions, make your statements, and we can have a live discussion about this topic. The lines are not going to be open until I say they're open. So let's just all hang tight and we can get started. So first things first, I'm gonna play the video of Afroman making those statements in Club Shay Shay. We're gonna take a listen. I'm gonna replay it, several times, just for those who are just joining who didn't see it the last time, and we can go ahead and just have a discussion about this topic and go in there because I want to go in depth about it and educate, because the statements he made, in my opinion, are just flat out uneducated. It is hateful, it is discriminatory, and it's not based on anything productive at all whatsoever. So without further ado, let's go ahead and play that, and we can go from there. But just a second, let me pull up this right here. I want to make sure we all sit here. Let's see how we're doing. Let's take 1 second. So yeah. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and play his video, and then we can have our discussions from there. Okay.
Real cool. You just have a big piece of real estate.
Yeah, I don't have time. I be rapping all the time.
Okay. You said 195 acres. You want to build your own community?
Yes. Afro-American.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say Afro-American. I am of African descent.
Correct.
Personally, I feel like we was betrayed and sold.
Okay.
To the point where I feel like it's my option to patronize that title or not. All due respect to them, if something jumped off and all Black people were attacked, I would stand with them for survival.
Great.
Okay, but I find a lot of arrogant, condescending, and disrespectful to Afro-Americans when they're here on the civil rights that our mothers and fathers and grandfathers fought for. I just think they ought to be a little bit more respectful under all the circumstances, and the circumstances that they betrayed us, backstabbed us, served,
Right.
sold us, and then they're living in America benefiting off of the civil rights that we fought for. That being said,
You're talking about white America, correct?
no, I'm talking about Africa. I'm talking
Oh,
about,
you're talking about Africans that came over.
right.
Okay.
The Africans, they sold us.
Right.
They sold us in slavery.
Right.
Then, a lot of them are condescending,
Okay.
disrespectful toward Afro-Americans.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so that being said, I call myself an Afro-American.
Okay.
Not denying I'm a descendant of an African.
Okay.
But just before the betrayal, I call myself an Afro-American. Now, as an Afro-American, I don't believe.
All right, so I think that's about it as far as what he said regarding Africans that I want to discuss. So that's where we're gonna take it from, and go in depth into discussing this matter. And there are many, many topics, many issues on this. And I'm going to open the lines pretty soon. And basically, you can call 832-569-3727, and we can have a live discussion. But first things first, let's tackle the first issue here. Did Africans betray African Americans? That is a flat out no. Okay? Let me start with the matter of slavery from time immemorial. Everywhere, every continent in the world, from the Americas to Europe, to Asia, to Africa, slavery has existed in one shape or form across all continents in human history. That is a flat out fact. Okay, you can look at history, you can look at the Bible, you can look at the Quran. There's been some type of slavery existing in every continent. So it was nothing new when in the 15th century people started being enslaved again, especially Africans to the Americas. Okay. But one thing remains clear. The nature of slavery across all the continents of the world was nothing like the slavery that existed or that was practiced in the Americas involving Africans transported to the Americas for slavery. That is one big fact that we can all agree on. So with that said, let's get down to whether or not there was betrayal of those who were enslaved and shipped out from African countries to the Americas. So first of all, how did this slavery happen? What was the origin of how people were transported from Africa to the Americas? Number one, most people who were enslaved came out of those who lost some type of a war. When the Europeans and Portuguese and whatever started coming to Africa, they gave them guns and some other new war equipment. And they encouraged these people to go out to fight other tribes. And whenever they conquered a tribe, right, or different nation, they enslaved those that lost and sold them to the Europeans out on the coast. Europeans never went in to go fight and capture slaves. Number one, they were outmanned, outnumbered, and the nature of the African continent was so not conducive to Europeans that they would easily die from diseases if they went into, if they went away from the coast. So they're mostly out on the coastal areas. So Europeans hardly ever went into the African continent to go capture slaves because they just didn't have what it took to go do that, both physically, manpower, outnumbered, and what have you. So oftentimes, when there was a war between two tribes or nations, those that lost were captured and they were sold to slavery. And the Europeans encouraged a lot of those wars most of the time. So that was one. It wasn't about betrayal, it was just the nature of war everywhere on the continent. So that was number one. Number two, even when there wasn't war and there was peace, there were people who were kidnappers. They go out of their way to find children who were isolated alone, maybe walking in the farm, walking alone, and they would capture these kids, put them on horses or in canoes, and transport them to the coast and sell them off as slaves. That was another way slaves were captured in Africa by Africans. They kidnapped children, took them to the coast, and sold them as slaves. Now, I'll give you a couple names of people who were captured as slaves, who we know their story. Some of them won their freedom back, and came back to Africa, or wrote a book or whatever. I'll give you two names of Africans that went through that. They were captured as children. Okay. The next one I want to talk about is the other way that people were enslaved was through, because back in the days they didn't have like prisons, right? Back in those days in Africa, there were no prisons. So what happened is that if someone did something abominable, committed a crime or did something horrendous, they didn't have a prison to go put them in. The easiest thing for the community to do is that, okay, well, this guy has done something abhorrent to the community. We're gonna take him out and have him sold as a slave and pushed away from the community. And that was another thing that was done. So you had prisoners of war, kidnappings of children, and people who were outcasts and sold off as slaves. So those were three main ways that I know of. There might be other ways that I'm not aware of. Anyone who knows can share. But those were some of the three main ways that people who had committed, that who were enslaved back in the days, from the African continent to the Americas. So those were the three ways. And I will give you two names of Africans. And let me go back and say this. Let me take a step back. The slavery that, like I said, the slavery that was practiced in Africa, and many other continents, Europe, Asia, was nothing like the slavery practiced in the Americas. And tell you what, most, if not all the Africans, I would say all the Africans, it's like today where we have like a news, TV, radio, newspapers. They did not know the type of slavery that was being practiced in the Americas. They had no idea, no knowledge of it. Okay, and when people were taken out, when people were enslaved in Africa, they were treated like, not like servants. They were not dehumanized and abused. They were just like people who were captured like as prisoners, right? And they were made to work to serve. And most of the times, those people who were captured as slaves can actually work their way out of slavery in Africa. They can become free again. They can pay off their debts and become a free person. There's usually a price tag, and they usually let them know what the price tag is so they can work and pay off that debt and become free. Just like in Europe, where you have gladiators who oftentimes were enslaved people who were made to fight, and oftentimes if they win a competition or whatever, they could be granted freedom, right, and allowed to and the granted freedom allowed to basically be free men again. And you can look at history or even some movies where these were discussed, in depth. So yes, in many parts of the world, people could buy their freedom. In the Americas, it was almost impossible to buy. It was impossible to buy your freedom. Okay, the only thing that could happen is that someone can buy you from your slave master and then free you. You couldn't really buy your own freedom. And even if you were freed, you had to go live in a place where slavery was not done. Either you are protected or you're taken to somewhere where slavery was done. In the Americas, some people go to Canada, some people go to the northeast of America when slavery was banned in the northeast of America. So those were the, that line, the Mason-Dixon line that I talked about. Those were the things that could happen. Because if you bought your freedom in Americas, okay, one thing that could happen is that if you get caught, you could be resold into slavery. In fact, people who were captured in the Northeast and were dragged back to the South and sold back into slavery, free black people in America. And that has happened many times. So it's not just about being free, but being free and going to a place where you're safe and protected. There are some black Americans who purchased the freedom of family members and kept them on their farm to protect them from slavery. And they just lived a normal life, doing stuff communally, but not being forced and dehumanized to work and what have you. But yeah, I'll give you two names of Africans who were captured as slaves and got their freedom, and in fact, they had a book that discussed how they were treated while they were in Africa before, one of them was shipped to the Americas. One of them was Jaja of Opobo. He's usually called King Jaja of Opobo. He was captured as a child, okay, kidnapped as a child, and transported away from home, and was a slave, and worked out in the coastal area of Nigeria. This is modern Nigeria, the coastal area. He was Igbo, of the Igbo tribe. He was captured, taken out to the coastal part of it. He was never sold off to the Europeans, but he kept working as a slave in the coastal area of what we now call Nigeria, southern Nigeria. While he was there working, he was a very good slave, very industrious, very intelligent, and he ended up making so much money trading, and he was able to buy his own freedom. Not only did Jaja of Opobo buy his own freedom, he became a king-like figure. He wasn't a king, but a king-like figure in there. He was controlling the whole area. He even fought off the British. I mean, think about it. Someone who was a slave in Africa become a king-like figure and fought off the British to protect that area from trade. He wanted to be the only one trading directly with the British and the Europeans. He pushed off all the other British traders. That's how powerful he was. Imagine a slave in America, back in when slavery was happening in America, buying his freedom and then becoming the president of the United States. Do you think that would have been possible? That's impossible. But in Africa, that was possible, where people were captured as slaves, because slavery there was not about dehumanization. It was more about servitude. You are more like an indentured servant, and you have to, pay your way off to become free again. And it was easy to do. It wasn't an insurmountable amount of money to buy your freedom. But that was what Jaja Wopu did. And you can look up. I have the picture of him on this podcast. So you can look him up. Jaja Wopobo, Jaja, and Opobo is Opobo, Jaja Wopobo. Absolutely incredible. So that is one. The other one was Olauda Equiano. And I think the correct pronunciation might be Oluda Equiano. And that's probably the correct pronunciation. And I'm going to spell his first name. The first name is Olauda. And his last name is Equiano. Oluda Equiano. So that's the other person. He was captured as a child. He was kidnapped as a child in Nigeria. In modern, it was Igbo, captured, dragged all the way down to the coast, and then traded to the Europeans and brought to America. And he worked as a slave. He was very bright, was eventually able to get his freedom, and when slavery was abolished, and moved to the United Kingdom. And that was how he became free, and wrote a book about everything that happened to him, and shared a lot of information about the evils of slavery in the Americas and how it should be abolished. One of you. So that was another one. And those two people show you that many people who were captured as slaves were kidnapped. Nobody was in favor of kidnappings. I mean, those children belonged to family members. Okay, those families didn't sell them off. They were kidnapped. Just like kidnappings happen every day in America. Children are being kidnapped and sold into sex slavery. The same type of principle, except back then it was labor slavery, right? So are we going to say today that because some women are kidnapped and then sold into sex slavery, that we as a society are betraying them and allowing them to become sex slaves? That is an enormous weight put on everybody, as if everybody supported that to happen. So as far as the African continent goes, you can see everybody was in support of children being kidnapped and sold into slavery. That people who were prisoners, who had done something abominable to society, who were sold into slavery. That was when I would say, okay, they weren't going to keep them as slaves; they had to sell them off. And then, as far as the war goes, whenever there was war, right, you have two different factions. One group wins, and the other group gets sold as slaves. That was common everywhere in the continent, everywhere in the world, not just in the African continent. But you can't say that it was betrayal, because that is, you're almost saying that every single African out there was in support of children being kidnapped or what have you, or being sold into slavery. And the Africans that did not know much about the type of slavery that was going on, they were thinking about the same type of slavery that they practiced in their own continent, where you're just a servant and you can then buy your freedom, become a king or whoever you want to be. Most adults were never really kidnapped and sold into slavery, because that would have been too much of a task to capture a grown man and enslave him. It takes a whole lot to do that. You need a lot more manpower to capture a man. So it was always easier to capture children. One or two people can capture a child and sell them and kidnap them and take them away. But for a man, probably going to need 4 or 5 people to kidnap a grown man because of the size and the strength. So yeah, that is what happened. I'm gonna give you guys my number. If you want to call in, 832-569-3727. You can call and have a discussion about this and go into more depth. Once again, the number is 832-569-3727. Let's have a discussion and see what you want to, what you think about what Afroman said. And I'm going to replay what Afroman said. Because I want you guys to hear what he said again. If you haven't already heard what he said, I'll replay it and we can go from there.
Africa. I'm talking
Oh, you
about.
from Africa that came?
Actually, let me go back a little bit.
Okay, but I find a lot of arrogant,
Let's go back a little bit more.
personally, I feel like we was betrayed and sold.
So that's where he started talking about the betrayal. Go back a little bit more and then.
So you don't have animals, you don't grow your own food. It's just you
So we're gonna get to it in a little bit.
Yeah, I don't have time. I be rapping all the time.
Okay.
I don't got time.
You said 195 acres. You want to build your own community?
Yes. Afro-American.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say Afro.
There we go.
I am of African descent.
Correct.
Personally, I feel like we was betrayed and sold
Okay.
to the point where I feel like it's my option to patronize that title or not. All due respect to them, if something jumped off and all black people were attacked, I would stand with them for survival.
Great.
Okay, but I find a lot of arrogant, condescending, and disrespectful to Afro-Americans when they're here on the civil rights that our mothers and fathers and grandfathers fought for. I just think they ought to be a little bit more respectful under all the circumstances, that they betrayed us, backstabbed us, served,
Right.
sold us, and then they're living in America benefiting off of the civil rights that we fought for. That being said,
You're talking about white America, correct?
no, I'm talking about.
All right, so he said something here that I need to touch on, which there's some truth to that. African Americans did a lot of the fighting for civil rights, and Africans who come here to America do enjoy a lot of that benefits. And I've seen Africans who don't even seem to understand or appreciate the fact that African Americans did a lot of the heavy lifting, and we should appreciate as the African diaspora in America, whether it be Caribbean, African, or European, African coming to America, we have to appreciate the heavy lifting the African Americans did in fighting for civil rights, because you wouldn't be enjoying America as it is if not for them making the landscape palatable for everybody to be able to buy houses, buy land, work, and whatever. Because you wouldn't have been able to have certain jobs, buy land, buy houses, because this is denied to African Americans. So Africans that came here are enjoying all those things like they would do in their own country, because African Americans made the landscape palatable, safe, and more conducive to living after the civil rights movement. But even with that, I want to make it clear that African Americans and the Pan-Africanism that happened between the 50s and the 60s was very much possible and fruitful because of Africans too. Because the civil rights movement came became more successful in the mid 1960s, from 65 to 1970. That was when you had a lot of things done. But the reason why America as a country allowed African Americans to gain those rights was not just because of Martin Luther King and all the other things that were going on. It was a combination of Pan-Africanism, but also because a lot of African countries were gaining their independence and becoming a complete autonomous black nation with a lot of power and resources. Okay? And America understood the fact that now that you have independent black nations overseeing everything going on in the world, that they now have to begin to respect the rights of African Americans. So African Americans cannot think that it was just they did all the work. You have African countries, Pan-Africanism, the Caribbean countries making a lot of efforts to ensure that African Americans gained their own rights, just as they were getting their independence in Africa. So you have many African countries gain their independence in the 50s, in the 1960, 1961, many African countries get independence. So there was a lot of Pan-Africanism going on, a lot of freedom movement going on, a lot of liberation going on. And that trickled down into America. So African Americans cannot think that they did all the work. Those African countries getting freedom also put pressure on America to give them liberties. Because many African prime ministers, even like Prime Minister of Nigeria, in the 1960s, came to America while JFK was here, they met with JFK and all that stuff. So there was a lot of interaction that was beginning between African countries and American government. So all those civil rights movements was partly part of that Pan-Africanism and that liberation going on everywhere. Marcus Garvey and all these guys who were from the Caribbean, they were from independent Caribbean countries coming out to America and talking about this liberation or what have you. So it was all part of it. So we can't just think that African Americans did all the work. African Americans received the beating, the brunt of the beating, and the ground dirty work and all that painstaking, but there was a lot of contribution from the African diaspora to support African Americans. So we can't just dismiss everybody else. We need to find ways to bridge the gap, to come together, to find unity. And that is something that the statements made by Afroman doesn't help. I mean, what benefit does it do us to say that, hey, Africans, betrayed us, they sold us? How many Africans sold someone into slavery? Very few people, right? Obviously, no African alive did that, but very few did. Okay, you have countries of nations and a few people who traded, who kidnapped children and sold them into slavery. After a war between neighboring tribes, they had the prisoners of war sold off. So very few amount of people were involved in that. So we shouldn't go out of our way and say that, we were betrayed. It doesn't do anything to bridge the gap, to unite, and what have you. So we have to stay away from that. And I don't think anyone should keep, because I've heard those things before. It's not the first time. We gotta push away those narratives, because it does look good to Pan-Africanism and to society as a whole. Because if you look at it today, African Americans live in America today. You have people who work together, they live together in the same communities, they intermarry with Caucasians all over the place. But then these were the same Caucasians who enslaved you and beat your ancestors. You don't have a problem sleeping with them, living with them, working for them, working with them, having them as a lawyer, your agent, your doctor, what have you. But you want to have something to say about an African who is living in America, an African American in America. Like, what good does it do? I mean, who is more brutal? The person who came up with the idea and who executed the idea versus the person who helped the originator of the idea. In other words, who is more guilty? The serpent or Adam? Adam fell, right? But the serpent did all the mind games and all the engineered all the thought process, and Adam just fell and followed. Okay, so we can't begin to say that Africans betrayed African Americans, because it was something that was not conceived the way it was conceived in the Americas. The concept of slavery in Africa was very, very different. Like I showed you, you could be a slave and then become a president, a king in Africa, but that wasn't possible in America. And anywhere in America, be it in Brazil or Argentina, anywhere of those places, or America, United States of America. But that was possible on the African continent because of the concept and the approach to that particular issue. So I'm really hoping that based on all the things I've given you, you guys would understand better and stay away from it. Once again, phone number to call in, if you want to call in, 832-569-3727. Let's have a discussion on this matter, break it down, and reach a better conclusion than what Afroman said. Another thing I want to talk about is that the only reason why someone would say something like they don't want to be called African Americans. Now, I understand that, yeah, it's been many generations that many African Americans have been removed from the African continent. But let's say, I know Africans began immigrating to America from the 1950s and 1960s, right? So if an African has immigrated to the Americas since the 50s and 60s and has been here for, let's say, 3-4 generations, should they now dissociate themselves from being called African Americans? They are willful immigrants to America. They've been here for 3 generations, 4 generations. Should they dissociate themselves from being called African Americans? No. Asians are not going to say, oh, my family has been here for 10 generations. We're no longer Asian Americans. We're just yellow Americans or something. That's not going to happen. You know, they are Asians regardless. Hispanics who have been here for many generations are still going to call themselves Hispanics. Okay? They might have other ways of referring to themselves, but they're still going to group themselves as Hispanics. Even if they might be Black Hispanics, Asian Hispanics, you know, European Hispanics, they still go by saying Hispanics. So for the only reason that African Americans will say they don't want to be called African Americans, but be called a color, Black Americans or whatever, is only an inferiority complex. There is no other reason. Trying to come up with some other reason is just a lie. Yes, I understand that they've been shown pictures of Africa, countries in war, and you've shown babies and flies and all that stuff on the faces. That's not the real Africa. Okay, they've shown an African country in its worst situation. So we have to grow up and move away from that. It is an inferiority complex to think that the only reason to think that you should not be referred to based on your heritage. You know, that is who you are, whether you like it or not. And to want to dissociate yourself from that is an inferiority complex. It's the epitome of inferiority complex. It's almost like hating on yourself. Generations of African Americans have been taught to hate on themselves and find ways to dissociate themselves from their heritage. And Afroman's comment is just one of those two things. As much as Afroman might want to dissociate himself from being called an African American, but be called an Afro American, I want to make it clear, you know, on a couple of things, that the perception of Black Americans, you know, both here in America and around the world, okay, is oftentimes, those perceptions, often negative, are inflicted on other persons of African descent in America. Because if you look at perceptions of, let's say, oh, Black men don't take care of Black fathers don't take care of their children, are not involved in the life of their children. That is not an African experience. African fathers are super involved in the life of their children. They raise them, they take care of them, they get married before they have children. You know, they take care of them, they raise them. They shape the life of their children. Everywhere on the African continent. Okay, but here in America, it's not the same. Now, the reasons why many African American fathers are not in the lives of their children are varied, both from the refusal to get married, you know, in high levels of incarceration, low unemployment, you know, a cultural norm of debauchery and just sleeping around and having multiple baby mamas and not being able to tie down to one woman. All those things factor into why the African American father is not involved in the life of the children as they should. But when they say Black, they put everybody under the same umbrella, and that is unfair because African fathers are more involved in the life of the children than even white fathers or Caucasian fathers or even European fathers. African fathers don't play about their children. They're always there, they're always present, super involved. Go anywhere on the African continent. It's a thing of pride to take care of a family. It's a thing of manhood to take care of a family. So it's not something that applies. When you use the word Black, to paint everybody with a brush in America. And so if Africans in America are suffering the consequences of the prejudice that goes with Black Americans, why is it now that Black Americans are making comments to try to dissociate themselves from being called African Americans just in order to fulfill that self-hate inferiority complex that they tend to have. So we have to move away from that. We have to look away from that. There was no betrayal by Africans. A very minute number of Africans were involved in the slave trade. A very minute amount of Africans supported in the slave trade because they had children who were kidnapped and sold into slavery. And that is very painful for any father, any family to go through that. Have a child stolen from you in the thin of the night. So we have to understand that it wasn't something that was supported. It was only under very minute circumstances where criminals were, sold off as slaves, and that was a very small portion of the society or the community. So other than that, we have to stay away from it at all times, and I hope that Afroman will learn from this, and that other African Americans will learn from this and understand their history and understand the true history of the slave trade, understand the complete history of Africa, that many kingdoms in Africa existed before the slave trade, understand how those kingdoms practiced their lives and how they controlled their nation before the coming of the Europeans. So that's as far as I would go with this. If you have any questions or comments, put it down in there. Tag Afroman to this, and let us have a positive discussion that would, push things further and not drag us backward. Because those comments he made about betrayal only take us back. It doesn't do anything positive or bring us any forward in any way. It only takes us backward. And so hopefully we can move beyond this and continue that Pan-Africanism in terms of a mental Pan-Africanism, nothing nationwide, but a Pan-Africanism that is about how we think and how we move and how we share our struggles. That's it for me today. If you got any more comments, put it down in the comment section. I will see you guys next time. Stay blessed.